Please welcome to the stage Sharon Lewin, AIDS 2014 Local Co-Chair.
Distinguished guests, friends and colleagues, it's amazing, we've done it. It's end of the conference. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Kulin Nation, and their elders past and present. Despite the jubilance of what we feel now, on Friday, July the 19th, our world changed when we awoke to the absolutely devastating news of MH17. The shock and horror that spread across the community of nations and our conference community was palpable. It was a horrific reminder of the perils of our global interdependence, so eloquently explored by President Clinton with us earlier this week. But I think this week has demonstrated what makes the HIV movement so unique and so inspiring. We've faced and overcome adversity since the very early days of the epidemic, and this week was no exception. Over the last 5 days, the intense dialogue, the demonstrations, the debates, and the commitment to continue and strengthen our work are the best tribute we could ever make to our 6 colleagues and all of those aboard MH17. As others have said, the future lies in unity and not in division. This week we've heard all of the great progress in the HIV response, but there is still much work to be done. In order for us to change an epidemic to low-level infection, we need an individualised approach to address key hotspots. We need a strong focus on specific geographic areas and key affected populations that continue to experience the highest numbers of infections. We need to recognise that one size will not fit all in our response. And now, more than ever, we need an increase in funding to do it. Now is not the time to slacken the pace. This week we've also heard that even after 30 years, stigma and discrimination continues to remain a major barrier implementing what we know works. If anything, this is getting worse in many parts of the world. Michael Kirby powerfully reminded us to hold governments accountable and to celebrate and applaud the great heroes who continue their work in unacceptably hostile environments such as Russia, Uganda and Nigeria. This is why we launched the Melbourne AIDS 2014 Declaration, which makes a clear and strong stand against those who would stigmatise, criminalise and discriminate against people based solely on their sexual preference or for engaging in sex work or for using drugs. To date, we have 3,742 signatures, but given we've had 13,600 participants here this week and 6,000 non-delegates visiting the Global Village, we really should have many, many more. So where are all your signatures? Please, I implore you to sign the declaration. As Sir Bob Geldof reminded us, one person's voice can make a difference, but the thousands and millions of voices is what politicians hear. Finally, we heard about the advances and significant challenges in finding a path to achieving sustained HIV remission, or a way to allow patients to safely stop antiretrovirals and keep the virus under control. We know this is possible, as we learnt from the Mississippi baby, but there is much work to be done to translate these lessons to feasible interventions that will be one day scalable and accessible. Our work on finding a cure must also never leave anyone behind. So what will be the enduring legacy for AIDS 2014? After all, that's why we are all here, to make a difference. Nationally, I'm incredibly proud of the Australian AIDS 2014 legacy statement The statement articulates a very bold commitment from all our state and territory health ministers to end new HIV infections in Australia by 2020, and a commitment to maintain what we're doing well, but do it better and do it globally. As Sir Bob Geldof again made very clear, Australia is one of the richest countries in the world, and we made a promise to the poorest, most vulnerable people in the world, which we are not fulfilling. We must do more. AIDS 2014 has been a great success in what I'm sure you will all agree were extraordinary circumstances. But conferences such as this can only happen with the contribution of many, many people and highly effective partnerships. A few key people must be recognised and thanked. First, I would like to thank my wonderful international co-chair, Françoise Barré-Sinoussi, not only for her support over the past 2 years, but also for her support during this extremely challenging week. Her leadership of the IAS as president over the past 2 years has been an absolute inspiration for all of us. I would also like to acknowledge the extensive support we've had for the conference from right across Australia at every level. From all my colleagues, the unbelievably committed clinicians and researchers and members of affected and at-risk communities, and at every level of government. A very special thank you to the Federal Australian Government, including both the Departments of Health and Foreign Affairs and Trade, the Government of the State of Victoria, and the City of Melbourne. As you will all agree, Melbourne really did put on a show this week, and I'm incredibly proud of what we've achieved. And more importantly, there was not a drop of rain. Take note. I would also like to thank the Melbourne Convention Bureau and the Melbourne Exhibition and Convention Centre for putting on a truly professional show in what are absolutely world-class facilities. A very warm thank you to the IAS and the Secretariat based here and in Geneva, all the members of the conference organising committees, the youth workforce, and our absolutely wonderful volunteers. And lastly, I thank all of you here today for bringing your work, your stories, your courage, and your passion to Melbourne. Together we have and will continue to make a difference to see the end of HIV. I look forward to seeing you all in Durban. Thanks very much.
Please welcome the Right Honourable Robert Doyle, Lord Mayor of Melbourne.
Could I first acknowledge Professor Sharon Lewin and Professor Françoise Barré-Sinoussi, the co-chairs of AIDS 2014 and a pair of absolute dynamos. Also Professor Chris Beyrer, International AIDS Society, and Sir Bob Geldof, and a special acknowledgement to our guests from Durban and AIDS 2016. Let me also acknowledge the traditional owners of the land upon which we meet today, the members of the Great Kulin Nation, and pay my deep personal respects to their elders past and present, and thank their elders, particularly the Wurundjeri and the Boon Wurrung, whose lands these are for the work they do throughout our community as we meet here today. We are a very young city in Melbourne, founded only in 1835. But we are very proud that our First Peoples are the oldest continuous culture in the world. This has not been an average week for the City of Melbourne. This has been a memorable week for the City of Melbourne. It's been a great honour to host the world's largest health and development conference. The major medical and scientific breakthroughs we've heard about this week have offered us great hope and progress towards reaching our goals. And you know, as I walked through the global village in particular, the commitment to remove stigma and discrimination against people living with AIDS was palpable, as was the commitment to prevention of infection. And as Sharon has just said to you, they will be welded together in a lasting social legacy through the Melbourne Declaration. No one left behind. But for me, and I hope you'll understand from my position as Mayor of this great city, I'm very proud of how Melbourne, our city, has embraced this conference and warmly welcomed thousands of guests. We did this through an unprecedented cultural program of 150 events that allowed the people of Melbourne to engage with you and with this conference. We did it through a massive show of support from city businesses and organisations that staged many events and activities. And we showed our solidarity at night with more than 50 buildings, floodlit red, across our city. But let me share with you two small stories that made me particularly proud. Everyday random acts of welcome. One of our Kenyan delegates arrived at the start of the conference, was understandably tired, and decided because he couldn't sleep, he would take a walk through our city very early in the morning. So at about 5:30 or 5:45 in the morning, found himself outside our great train station, Flinders Street Station. No one in sight, and a map in his hand, ready to explore the city. One of my street sweeping trucks, you know, the big ones with the big revolving brushes at the front, pulls up with a screech of brakes. The driver took off his headphones and he said, "Mate, can I help you? Are you at the conference? Can I give you directions?" The second little story, one of our delegates, Jack Downey from the International AIDS Society, and another guest caught a taxi from the airport into the city. The driver engaged them in conversation. He impressed them with his knowledge of this conference and his enthusiasm for this conference, AIDS 2014, and then he offered to give them a free 10-minute quick guided tour of the city in his taxi. I think you can understand why I feel proud that the city has embraced the important work of this conference. Finally, could I say to the AIDS 2014 team at the City of Melbourne, to our magnificent volunteer army, and in particular to Fran Curlin from the City of Melbourne, a big thank you for all your hard work. From us to the City of Durban, we hope that AIDS 2016 is a landmark success and everything that you wish. From Melbourne, we love you all. Please come back.
Please welcome John Manwaring and Violet Banda to speak on behalf of the conference community partners.
A bit taller than the mayor. Sorry. My apologies. Thank you, and thank you all for coming to Melbourne this week. It's been an absolutely incredible week. Just getting to see you share your stories, your wisdom, your strength. As I said, I'm John Manwaring, and I am HIV positive. I was asked to speak today as a member of the community most affected by HIV in Australia, that is, young gay men. As is obvious from my accent, I'm not from here. I'm from the US originally, but have chosen to make Australia my home. I was reflecting on this and I realized that until recently, my home country didn't allow people with HIV to visit, much less to migrate to it. When the ban was finally lifted, President Obama said it was a policy rooted in fear rather than in fact. Now this cuts right to the heart of the matter, fear. Every day, those of us living with HIV have to contend with fear and the irrational, often cruel reactions it incites. These reactions take many forms, whether a senseless remark or something as serious as a law that enshrines hatred and perpetuates stigma. These laws, these seemingly insurmountable barriers, are devastating. They fly in the face of all the progress we as a community have worked and fought and died to achieve. When governments legitimize homophobia and transphobia, when they criminalize sex work and drug use, when they stifle the rights and voices of women and youth, when they take us, the marginalized segments of society, and try to suffocate us into non-existence, they promote fear. They promote hate. They put policy above humanity. They enable stigma to thrive. It's incredibly tempting to give in, to give up, to fall silent, and quietly hope that in time things might get better. But the people, the groups, the governments that oppress us, they want us to think we're powerless, that we should sit down, be quiet, and fall back into the shadows. But if the past has taught us anything, it is this: silence equals death. And I say that, and it seems casual, because I recognize that many people here come from places in the world where speaking out is dangerous, where speaking out is death. It's a very hard truth to accept, but we do need to speak up. Because as I've heard people speak over this past week, I have realized an undeniable truth. We are more powerful than we know. Right here at this moment in this room is the power to change the world. It doesn't require any special skill or talent. It requires from us only one thing: honesty. A simple conversation, one that is open, fearless, and forthright, will change the hardest of hearts and the coldest of minds. When those of us living with HIV come out into the light and share our stories, we dispel the fear, the stigma, and the hate. In the eyes of those who oppose us and oppress us, when we talk to them, we're no longer stereotypes and statistics. We're human. So starting now and up until Durban, I urge each and every one of you, don't be scared anymore. Be yourself. Be proud. Share your story. It isn't up to governments and NGOs to fix this for us. This is our cause. This is our time. And together we will put an end to HIV. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, and fellow youth, it gives me a great pleasure to have this opportunity to speak at the end of this conference. And I thank organizers for inviting me. At such moments, you wonder how fast the days have gone, and you wish a few more days could be added. However, what is important is not how long we sit to discuss best practices, but what action this translates into when we return home. The conference addresses issues that affect all people from different walks of life. But the common denominator that brought us here is to have to respond to the great epidemic of the century. Seeing the passion and effort that individuals have committed to the cause, I realized that the hope of eliminating new infections, ending stigma and discrimination, and stopping our brothers and sisters of dying due to AIDS is not just a dream. As a young person living with HIV, I will go home to assure my fellow youth that yes, there are people who care out there. What I, as a young person who have experienced something I do not wish on anyone else. I was born with HIV, and I experienced stigma all my life. Discrimination and all the shame of living with HIV must come to an end. This conference marks a new beginning in my life, and I hope it is the same with you all. We heard this week about an assessment of WHO guidelines on prevention of vertical transmission in Africa. Where there is community involvement in programs, retention rates of women diagnosed as positive during pregnancy are greatest. This conference has shown that science alone will not eliminate HIV. We need meaningful engagement of community to break down stigma. In particular, the involvement of young women with HIV who are most affected by this pandemic. I also want to pay my respect to our dear friends who were on the way to this conference and met with the tragedy that cut their lives. We take a comfort in the knowledge, though, that yes, they too wanted to contribute towards achieving the 3 zeros. You can make a difference in your community when you get back so that they did not die in vain. The work we came for does not end here. It continues as we return to our communities and help make a difference. As we plan to meet again in Durban, I hope some of the people employed in this HIV industry will be made redundant and find new jobs. The jobs should be like construction industry, changing ART clinics into schools for young and healthy people. Slowly but surely moving towards ending HIV. I hope that in 2016, the voices of young people will be loud and strong. On behalf of all people living with and affected by HIV, I welcome you to Durban, Zikomo. Thank you so much.
Меня зовут Руслан. Я из Крыма, из города Ялт.
Меня зовут Валентин. Я из города Евпатория, из Крыма.
Меня зовут Юрий. Я из Симферополя, Крым.
На ЗПТ я с 2009 года.
За это время я бросил уличные наркотики.
Наладил свою жизнь.
Трудоустроился.
Вернулся в социум.
Помирился с семьей.
Родил сына.
И начал нормальную жизнь.
Благодаря ЗПТ мы могли работать.
Следить за своим здоровьем.
Создавать семьи.
Растить детей.
Просто жить. Мы не представляли никакой угрозы для общества.
Находясь под постоянным
медицинским контролем.
В наших действиях не было никакого криминала.
Вместе с ЗПТ у нас забрали наше будущее.
Сделали нашу жизнь в Крыму невозможной.
Лишив нашей семьи покоя.
Мы живем в регионе Восточной Европы и Центральной Азии. В регионе, где особенно остро стоит вопрос эпидемии СПИДа и других социально значимых заболеваний. Всякий запрет или даже отсутствие должного внимания к ценностям снижения вреда в нашем регионе обязательно приводит к негативным последствиям и даже смерти людей. Я постоянно нахожусь на связи с теми, кто остался в Крыму, и с теми, кто уехал в Украину для продолжения курса заместительной поддерживающей терапии. Трезво оценивая сложившуюся ситуацию, мы все же продолжаем надеяться на то, что выход будет найден. К сожалению, никто из крымчан не смог приехать в Мельбурн в этот раз. Но это не может помешать нам высказать слова глубокой благодарности за вашу поддержку и ваше желание помочь нам в это сложное для нас время. Мы не опускаем рук, мы готовы бороться за свои права, а ваша поддержка придает нам сил. Наши сердца бьются в унисон с вашими. Из Крыма с любовью.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Elliot Ross Albers, Executive Director of the International Network of People Who Use Drugs Secretariat.
Ironically, for a talk at an AIDS conference, I want to start off quite far from HIV, which is, in my view, not the real issue that binds the key affected populations together. HIV is a symptom and not necessarily the cause of what really brings us, as people who inject drugs, together with sex workers, gay men and other men who have sex with men, transgender people, people living with HIV and hepatitis C, as communities, as individuals and as activists. We have all felt the devastating impact that stigma can have upon our lives, whether it be in the form of denial of access to vital healthcare services, to employment, to the right to enter certain countries, to family life, or the denial of our agency and pathologization of our behavior. Stigma kills members of our very diverse, intermingled and overlapping communities, not metaphorically, but in reality and brutally. The flip side of stigma is that you have to look to your own people, to people shunned as you are, for support, for comfort, for solidarity, for community. Herein lies the reason why community movements and cross-community solidarity play such a vital, inspiring and vivid role. For by recognizing that we have only ourselves to rely upon, communities have realized that we must organize ourselves, provide the services that we need, defend ourselves, educate ourselves about our rights and health, and advocate for ourselves and our equally criminalized allies. In that spirit, the International Network of People Who Use Drugs supports the call of the global sex worker rights movement for a boycott of ICAP 2015 if the Bangladeshi government does not support the livelihoods and human rights of the sex workers evicted from the Tangai brothels. Two bodies of international law, namely human rights law on the one hand and drug control law on the other, exist in parallel universes. Professor Paul Hunt, UN Special Rapporteur on the right to the highest attainable standard of health, noted that this widespread systemic abuse of human rights is especially shocking because drug users include people who are the most vulnerable, most marginal in society. Despite the scale of the abuse, despite the vulnerability, there is no public outrage, no public outcry, no public inquiries. On the contrary, sometimes it even receives some public support. The pursuit of repressive drug control in the name of the war on drugs has inexorably driven rampant human rights abuses against people who do use drugs. These include the hundreds of thousands in compulsory drug detention centres in Asia, women who use drugs who are subject to violence, including sexual violence at the hands of the state. It includes the mob violence visited upon people who use drugs in East Africa and in Northeast India, and as you've seen, denial of services to people who use drugs in the Crimea and the wider Eastern European and Central Asian region. For one set of international law to systemically drive breaches of another is an increasingly untenable situation. Whilst there is no hierarchy of legal systems, it is arguable that human rights law and the indivisible, inalienable, and universal principles upon which it is based should unequivocally trump the pursuit of another set of laws that are producing such gross rights violations. When the pursuit of drug control law becomes a driver of widespread human rights abuses, it is without doubt time to call for a thorough review of those laws. As the Global Commission on Drug Policy noted, instead of investing in effective prevention and treatment programs to achieve the required coverage, governments continue to waste billions of dollars each year on arresting and punishing drug users. At the same time, repressive drug policies have fueled the stigmatization, discrimination, and mass incarceration of people who use drugs. There is no doubt that the pursuit of punitive prohibition and the war on people who use drugs is driving such breaches of human rights. When you define public policy as a war, you are going to produce war casualties. In response to this war, we are calling for a peace. We are calling for an amnesty for drug war prisoners, for an end to the violence and rights violations that have been heaped upon our community with impunity. And we are calling for an intelligent and open debate on humane alternatives. The state of war in which we are living is one waged in the name of morality, of social order, and in defense of the right of the state to control the bodies and minds of its citizens. This war against the supposed threat to society that some drugs pose has in reality made communities of people who use drugs the real targets. It has made us into casualties of war, and it has made us into scapegoats for much of society's ills. Let me be clear. The 1961 Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs uses unprecedentedly extreme language to describe people who use certain drugs as evil. This labeling, enshrined in international law, has very real consequences for our lives and hinders the response to HIV and hepatitis C. It can no longer be claimed that human rights violations occurring in the name of the war on drugs are aberrations. They are rather the logical consequence of the pursuit of this war. This is why we call upon activists from our sister communities to join us in calling for an end to the war on people who use drugs, an end to the war on our communities, and an end to the endemic stigmatization, marginalization, discrimination, physical and structural violence that it has entailed. We are routinely denied access to appropriate healthcare services, including access to sterile needles and syringes, opiate substitution programs, and treatment for both HIV and hepatitis C. We are denied education and the right to vote, denied the right to enter certain countries. We have been flung into jails, prisons, and forced detoxification centres that are nothing more than forced labour camps. We have been denied access to our children and subject to corporal and indeed capital punishment. Corporate greed has now set the price of the new drugs that can cure hepatitis C at $1,000 per pill, or $84,000 for a curative course. The combination of repressive legal environments, structural barriers, and impediments to healthcare, legal redress and support has directly and is directly fueling the twin epidemics of HIV and hepatitis B and C currently raging through the drug-using community. The disproportionate burden of these bloodborne viruses carried by the injecting community, with 3 million out of 16 million living with HIV, but only 4% receiving ART, is directly attributable to the legal environment in which we live and the discrimination to which we are subject. HIV is both a biological fact and an exploiter of social vulnerability. poverty and structural fault lines. As such, we need a socio-political, human rights respecting and community-based response, along with the biomedical one. The war on people who use drugs has fallen most heavily on ethnic minorities, indigenous people, the poor, young people and women, particularly pregnant women who use drugs. These multiple markers of stigma and exclusion have fueled mass incarceration, coerced sterilisation, police victimisation, violence, and actively driven both HIV and hepatitis B and C amongst our community. This tidal wave of flagrant, systemically driven human rights abuses must be brought to an end. And the only way to do so is to attack the problem at its root. This means calling for a thorough overhaul of the UN conventions that comprise the global regime of drug prohibition and that drive the war on people who use drugs. Superficial redress and minor reform will not staunch the flow of systemic rights abuses directed at people who use drugs, their families and communities. Only the end of the war on people who use drugs through international legal reform will suffice to end this panoply of inhumanity. To ensure that this war ends, we are calling upon members of other criminalised communities, upon the AIDS movement, upon human rights defenders and advocates to join with the drug-using community in working to ensure that ending the architecture of global prohibition is firmly on the table at the UN General Assembly Special Session on Drugs in 2016. Without an end to the global war that has long been fought upon my community, there will be no end to HIV or to hepatitis C. Thank you.
Please welcome Professor Françoise Barré-Senoussi, International Co-Chair of AIDS 2014 and President of the International AIDS Society.
Distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, good evening. We all have been living a week filled with many emotions, sadness, anger. But I really want to thank each one of you for the dignified and respectful atmosphere in which that conference happened. It truly honored the memory of our lost friends, as well as those of all the passengers of the MH17 flight. It seems to me that the tragic event of last week has also infused in all of us a renewed feeling of unity. Our community has once again demonstrated that in the face of adversity, we are able to come together in solidarity and show the world that nothing can stop us. UNAIDS announced that almost 14 million patients have now access to antiretroviral treatment. We are on track to reach the UN goal of 15 million by 2015. I remember 15 years ago some people saying that universal access was just a dream. Well, I guess this is the proof that when the whole world is mobilized toward one goal, then dreams can become reality. And they will also, for the million of other HIV-positive patients that are still in need of those antiretroviral treatments. But not only. 2014 is a turning point in chronic hepatitis C treatment with extremely efficient drugs coming to the market, able to cure up to 90% of patients. In the light of what has been largely discussed during the week, let me say, let's use the experience gained over the years in the HIV fight to reduce HCV treatment costs and make the universal access a dream coming true for the 150 million patients with chronic hep C. We all know that the unprecedented international mobilization against HIV/AIDS has furthered the concept of global health. Everywhere, the investment in the AIDS response has catalyzed general health improvements in addressing the issues of co-infection and morbidities, in addressing the issues of maternal and child health, in building stronger health systems by strengthening infrastructures, laboratory and human resources. The mobilization against AIDS is also a strong driver to advance other areas such as human rights. There will be no end of AIDS without ensuring respect and dignity of all people, equity in access to health services and social justice. I'm very glad that the past week clearly reaffirmed that our engagement goes largely beyond HIV. Australia will host the next G20 summit in a few months, and the deadline for the Millennium Development Goal is next year. In this context of big international rendezvous, I strongly believe that we must further increase our collaboration with other major international health movements at every level of the response, because our objective is to build a better future for all. This is what global health is about. For more than 2 years, a number of people have worked very hard to put this conference together. First, I would like to address my deepest and most sincere thanks to my co-chair, Sharon, and the fantastic AIDS 2014 team in Melbourne for their incredible work you have all done. Sharon, it has been such a pleasure to work on your side over those past years. I will remember it forever. I would like to sincerely thank all the members of the Conference Coordinating Committee, the Conference Program Committee, the track committees, the Young's Program Committee. You are all truly made a brilliant program. Thank you to all the conference partners, to our donors, our sponsor, AbbVie, Gilead, MSD, and Vive Healthcare. To all the IAS staff, my heartfelt thanks for the long hours, efficiency, and good nature assistance. To our volunteers, as always, a huge thank you. You are the source of pride to this event. Finally, thanks to you, to all the delegates who made this event the success it is. As you all know, this is my last conference as the president of the International AIDS Society. I would like to take this occasion to say that I am really grateful I was given the opportunity to serve the IAS and beyond the global HIV community in that position. And of course, if the community wish, I will continue to try to be your voice. I'm very happy and proud to introduce now the next president of the IAS, Chris Berger. Chris is a friend now. He's also a man for who I have a great admiration for. For those of you who might not know him, Chris is a physician and an internationally renowned epidemiologist, professor at Johns Hopkins University, Bloomberg School of Public Health. Chris is particularly known for being a champion in the field of HIV and human rights for more than 2 decades. He has done a tremendous amount of work on key affected populations in Burma, Thailand, Southern Africa, and Eastern Europe. He is indeed the co-chair, with another friend of mine, Michel Kazachkin, of the IAS Working Group on Key Affected Population. Chris is one of the most passionate advocates for social justice and human rights, and I have no doubt that IAS is in very good hands under his presidency. I like now to invite Chris to join me to present together the 2014 IAS Presidential Award. It's a special award this year. The IAS Presidential Award is aimed at recognizing the achievements of individuals who demonstrate a long history of leadership and excellency as pioneers or advocates at the forefront of the response to HIV and AIDS. The award highlights contributions that have resulted in increased knowledge, skills, creative solutions, or evidence-based policies and programs to enhance the global response to HIV. It's really my immense pleasure to invite award winner Eric Gooseby on stage. The International AIDS Society honored Eric for his outstanding commitment in the response to HIV and his extraordinary impact on the epidemic.
Eric Gooseby has spent the past 3 decades fighting HIV. He started his early career caring for AIDS patients at the San Francisco General Hospital after graduating from the University of California, San Francisco. Eric witnessed the devastating effects of AIDS in the early years when no treatment was available. This experience stayed with him when he was called to Washington to guide programs to fight the epidemic within the United States. As National AIDS Policy Director in the White House, he convened the guidelines for antiretroviral therapy for adults, adolescents, and pregnant women. His appointment as United States Ambassador and Global AIDS Coordinator gave him the opportunity to have an enormous impact on the HIV response on a global scale by guiding the international HIV strategy of the USA and directing the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, PEPFAR, the largest national program to respond to HIV internationally. Under Eric's truly visionary leadership, he helped turn the emergency focus of PEPFAR to one of sustainability, enabling countries to enhance their capacity to govern and manage their own related public health programs. The 2014 IAS Presidential Award is awarded to Eric Gooseby for his long-term commitment and leadership working in the HIV field at local, national, and international levels.
Well, thank you so much. It's really very moving to receive this from this group. I'm truly deeply grateful to receive this award. I want to thank the International AIDS Society for giving me this acknowledgement and singling me out from all those who are so deserving and have been dedicated in their professional careers to developing and delivering care and services. It represents an exclamation point in my career and is coming from this collective community, my community, means a great deal to me. It also is a privilege that I am receiving this award in Australia, a country that showed the world that they could come together and mount a response that effectively addressed transmission in injection drug users and MSM communities, and that targeted outreach and harm reduction strategies linked to healthcare were effective in dropping transmission. Australia blunted their epidemic and saved hundreds of thousands of lives by letting the science inform the response. It takes a village to raise a child, but it takes a world to respond to HIV. The remarkable advances are breathtaking to reflect on. When I think back to 1981 and the crescendo in admissions with this unknown disease at UCSF San Francisco General, the recognition that this was different, that we didn't know what we were dealing with, the fear it generated in our patients and in us, matched with the anxiety of not knowing at the time how it was transmitted, truly remains a vivid memory. I can remember our community in San Francisco, Paul Voberding, Don Abrams, Connie Woofsey, Molly Cook, Merle Sandy, John Mills, Marcus Conant, Bill Owens, and so many active, engaged individuals in the community. Just as we came together in San Francisco then, others, you, came together in countries all over the world, in hospitals, clinics, and community settings to respond to a growing series of unknowns that put a huge morbidity and mortality directly in front of us. Each of you playing your role to developing an effective delivery system that was accessible, trying to do always what was in the best interest of your patients and clients. As a world, we came together and began a sustained period of inquiry that continues today, that defined the agent, how it creates immune dysfunction in an individual, and how it moves through a population and community. The convergence of so many people focused on this problem from prevention to treatment has allowed us to put almost 14 million people in a sustainable relationship with an effective delivery system and drop the number of new infections precipitously. A remarkable achievement, a fragile achievement, but we were only halfway there. We also became aware of how HIV has the ability to target those most vulnerable. And in an uncanny fashion, HIV has always managed to highlight the weaknesses in our medical response and in our society as it targets those most vulnerable. As the scientific and healthcare community, we must stand against policies, laws, and practices that diminish the ability for those in need to access care, to be retained in care, or to be discriminated against in exercising their right to life-sustaining health services. We have come too far to slow down now. We indeed can end AIDS and hold new infections to a minimum. We have developed the ability to prevent disease and to treat it, but we continue to be burdened with issues of implementation. Just as we have defined determinants of disease, it is time to define the determinants of performance, to ensure programs are aligned with the movement of the virus through the population, follow the demographics, and deliver interventions and treatments that demonstrate impact. It is time to recommit to an intensification of our efforts to target those at highest risks, hotspots, men who have sex with men, injection drug users, transgender, sex workers, pediatric cases, and ensure that they too benefit from the science that is already known and understood. We, those in my age group, and you know who you are out there, have started something that you, in the younger years, will finish. Consistent with the long tradition of see one, do one, teach one, our long march to an AIDS-free generation will continue until there are no new infections, and for those infected, we continue to work on a cure. Joop Langer and all of our colleagues who lost their lives in the Malaysian flight MH17 last week as an inevitable and tragic loss, one that we feel collectively as a community, offering our deepest condolences to the families, colleagues, and friends who are left behind. I know I will always hold Joop's energy in my thoughts. His contribution was multifaceted and complex, but he will stand as an inspiration because he lived a life that was so useful. He was honorable and compassionate, and in all its manifestations, he lived a life that made a difference for so many. The life he had was a life well lived, and for that I will be forever grateful to him. So I want to thank you for this distinguished honor. Thank you so much.
It's just not finished.
Well, as a special surprise for Eric, I would like to welcome Jack Whitescarver, Dr. Jack Whitescarver from the Office of AIDS Research of the NIH to the stage. At the inaugural IAS Presidential Award ceremony at AIDS 2010 in Vienna, Dr. Whitescarver was the recipient of this prestigious award, and at that time, Eric Gooseby, then the PEPFAR director, read a letter for him from President Obama. Now this time around, it is Eric Gooseby who is receiving the IAS Presidential Award, and Dr. Whitescarver will read a letter from President Obama.
Thank you very kindly. And Mr. Ambassador, or on a more personal note, my dear friend Eric, I carry with me today a letter from the United States Secretary of State, the Honorable John Kerry. But it's with great pride that I read the message from the President. I'm pleased to join all those gathered for the 20th International AIDS Conference in honoring Ambassador Eric Gooseby, MD. For decades, Ambassador Gooseby has dedicated himself to combating HIV and AIDS. As a young doctor in San Francisco, he treated patients as AIDS first emerged, and he later brought the expertise he developed locally to the national level, helping to shape our country's policies on HIV and AIDS. In his role as America's Global AIDS Coordinator and in his work outside of government, Ambassador Gooseby has applied his immense talent and unwavering compassion on a global scale to save lives around the world and put the promise of an AIDS-free generation within reach. Eric, this prestigious recognition speaks to your outstanding leadership in the fight to end this disease. I am deeply grateful for your service in my administration, and I send you my warmest congratulations on this special occasion. Signed, Barack Obama.
Good luck to our president.
So in the interest of innovation, I'm going to try and not use paper and use my iPad. Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, friends and colleagues. It's my distinct honor to speak to you today as the incoming president of the International AIDS Society, and I truly am humbled to stand before you as we look at the tasks we need to do together, at the work undone that still has to be done to conquer this pandemic. I think I can speak for us all when I say that after the tragic events of M117, we all feel a profound sense of renewed commitment to the work which our treasured friends and colleagues dedicated their lives. Today, I want to ask for your support and engagement in making sure the world's attention continues to stay focused on the epidemic and that we do, indeed, step up the pace. But before I do, I want to first express my deepest thanks to Françoise Barré-Sinoussi, who has so ably led the IS these past years. We all know that Françoise is a great scientist and a great humanitarian. But Françoise, working with you so closely over these last years, I've learned what a profoundly wise and generous woman you are, and for your mentorship and your friendship, merci beaucoup. We are at an enormously important crossroads in the HIV response. Our scientific and program advances, many presented at this conference, are cause for real optimism that we can contain the epidemic and that those among us living with HIV can live the long, full lives everyone deserves. We can end pediatric AIDS. We can leverage the platforms and strategies we've built to cure millions living with hepatitis C and TB. And we can use new prevention technologies and approaches to make sexual life safe for our young people, straight, gay, transgender, and questioning. The enormous question before us is not can we do this, but will we? I wish I could tell you that I was optimistic about our continued success, but I think we must face several critical challenges in the years ahead or risk failure. None of these will be easy to address. Nothing in the AIDS response has been easy for any of us over the decades. But I think we really have three things ahead that we have to pay attention to. And the first is exclusion. In 2013 and 14, we've had a wave of discriminatory laws and policies that are setting us backwards toward exclusion, limiting rights, reducing healthcare access, and aiding and abetting the virus. Here's just one example. Rosemary Namubiru, a 65-year-old nurse living with HIV who is right now serving a 3-year prison sentence in Uganda, wrongfully jailed in an alleged transmission case. Indeed. How does jailing this HIV-positive provider help Uganda respond to AIDS? And here's another. When the Putin administration annexed the Crimean Peninsula, they announced the cessation of methadone on the first day of that occupation. Boo, that's right. People who inject drugs across Eastern Europe and Central Asia continue to be denied the basics of HIV services, and it should surprise no one that the epidemics there continue to worsen and expand in 2014. We should all be deeply concerned about the anti-gay laws and policies being enacted in Russia, India, Nigeria, Uganda, and now being actively debated in too many more countries. Not only because they restrict basic human rights and freedoms, but because these laws threaten the entire HIV response. So I'm the first openly gay person to lead the IAS. And as a man who buried too many friends and lovers and patients before we had effective treatment, let me pledge that inclusion for all who need it and want HIV services will be a fundamental focus of my leadership. The second challenge we have is, of course, the treatment gap. It's unacceptable that so many people died of HIV last year and the year before, that children continue to be among the least treated of our human family. And with the new WHO guidelines, more than 28 million people are now eligible for ART, and still, perhaps half or a little less than half are actually getting it. With that many millions of people living with HIV in 2014 and untreated, we are not going to end AIDS anytime soon. And we have to frankly acknowledge that there's a real risk that we won't succeed. We're all aware of new targets for 2030, but I'd like to propose that we think about what might be able to be achieved leading to Melbourne and just in the next 2 years. 2030 is a long way off. Just keeping the pace at where we are now will require providing ART to at least 4 million more people by the middle of 2016. How does that sound as a goal for 2016? And here's another. As you heard from Elliot, as few as 4% of injection drug users worldwide, and perhaps only 14% of men who have sex with men who are living with HIV are receiving ART. This has got to change. Let's commit to gathering, Let's commit to gathering in Durban, able to say that we have made real and measurable progress in expanding treatment and prevention to key populations and to everyone else who needs it, without which we really cannot hope to end AIDS in any region of the world. Finally, my last challenge to us all is that we are at risk for the HIV pandemic falling off the global agenda before we are done. It would be an immense human tragedy to fail at this stage. We're going to need more solidarity, more commitment as we leave Melbourne together. And we still have a hugely important scientific research agenda ahead in cure, in an HIV vaccine, in research, in the continuum of care from adolescence to aging, in health systems, in implementation science, in human rights, the law, and law enforcement. But I do have one real additional note of optimism. And that is that I am so honored to be serving as co-chair of the Durban AIDS 2016 conference with my friend, Dr. Olive Shoshana. Olive is the first woman from Africa to chair an international AIDS conference. And we will be gathering together in Durban, where, as everybody in this audience knows, young women have the highest rates of HIV infection they face anywhere in the world. Friends, we must change our fundamental understanding of these conferences. Our time together can't simply be an every 2-year gathering of our community, however much that matters to us all. It's just not enough. We have to see the time between conferences as a road from where we are to where we want to be, and commit ourselves to creating that change and to holding ourselves and our community accountable. over the next 2 years. Therefore, right now, we begin the road to Durban, a 2-year campaign to define what the response must look like if we're to achieve the targets set out at this meeting. Notice I say must. This is not a should situation. If we want to be treating 4 million more people by 2016, how many more will we have to offer testing and linkage to care? If we want to eliminate HIV travel restrictions, and we do, then we're committed to doing more between now and Durban to make that a reality. The world is going to look at us in 2016 and ask what we've done since 2000 and the last Durban AIDS conference to still deserve their attention, and we must have some compelling answers. The HIV movement has shown remarkable resilience and smarts and courage, never better exemplified than the way we've come together in Melbourne at a time of tragedy and loss. We'll need all of our best efforts and more if we're going to prevail in this struggle, but failure, of course, is just not an option. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for the work you do. Let me wish all who are traveling the safest of journeys home. And let me add one final note of optimism. I'd like to introduce you to the new President-elect of the International AIDS Society, the outstanding researcher and clinician, Professor Linda Gale Becker from the University of Cape Town and the Desmond Tutu HIV Research Center. Linda Gale. Finally, it is a great honor and a pleasure to introduce the artist and extraordinary humanitarian, Sir Bob Geldof. Indeed. Thank you. Thanks, sir. Those of you who heard his unbelievable remarks earlier in the week, Bob gave us a real charge for action, a call to action, and we're so deeply grateful for your attendance, Thanks, for your words and your wisdom.
Is this for me?
Why not?
Why not? Whose is this?
Eric Goosby's here, I'll take it.
I thought I was going to get something for my trouble. I was awake at 4 this morning, jet lag or maybe something bothering me. I couldn't really identify it, but I got up and turned on the telly in the hotel room and was half asleep and transfixed and utterly depressed by the parade of horror for 2 hours that cascaded across my television screen. And I moved from channel to channel, from Russian TV to Al Jazeera, to Fox, to BBC World News, to France 24, to ABC, to Chinese state television, and all of them. And it was a non-stop pornography of terror, unremitting brutality, as if all the world had only one thing to say to itself, that all there was the recognition that brute force was enough to resolve anything and everything. Face after face came on the screen in a complete logical belief that what they were doing was just and right, and that their own particular view of justice would prevail over everything and in the end. And being Irish and referencing what I talked about with Waleed Ali yesterday, I thought of Yeats's great prophetic poem, The Second Coming. Many of you will know where he describes this slimy, slow-driven beast, slouching towards Bethlehem to be born. It's called the Second Coming because Yeats didn't quite know what he was seeing in that great poetic imagination. And you'll remember, I think, a lot of you, some of the key lines from that work of genius. Things fall apart. The center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed. The ceremony of innocence is drowned. Now, when I'm in Africa, and when I'm amongst the victims that all of you have been talking about and have been working with for 30 years, I see the ceremony of innocence being drowned by a vast wave of indifference. And I see the blood-dimmed tide of our indifference engulfing them. Things fall apart. And ladies and gentlemen, we just simply cannot continue into the 21st century with the world that I was watching for 2 hours on my television last night. We can't do that. Perhaps we're watching the dissolution of the ideas of the 20th century, finally. Perhaps the 21st century is about to begin, finally. I take you back to some of the things I was talking about with Walid yesterday, that it took until 1914 for the 19th century to end. Will it take the same cataclysm for the 20th century to finally end and our own century to begin? Maybe we're witnessing all the dissolutions of the systems put in place in that horrendous 75-year war that was the 20th century. But we've yet to discover what the new systems may be. The center didn't hold. Now, the defining logic of the 20th century was competition. If we are to survive as a species, and I specifically go to the heart of the human species, because the others will survive, some may not survive us, but they will survive. If we are to survive as a species, then we must reject that defining logic of the last century that led to the most brutal and terrifying century in all human history, where countless tens of millions were slaughtered and impaled upon the unlikely spikes of even more ludicrous ideologies, vast dreams of a meaningless utopia. So our century must be defined by the things that define you, your job, this conference, and the grave issue that you face. And they are cooperation, consensus, and compromise. The world shrinks. For 2 hours I saw the world as one last night in their brutal inter-family wars. And I've got this thing in my pocket that can communicate with everyone, anyone, all the time, anywhere. It presupposes whole new ways of behaving. Probably the most important invention ever in human history. Gutenberg did not realize what he'd wrought with the printing press, but in 25 years, the destruction of elites, The changing of the old guard in power and the democratization of knowledge was apace, and reason began to overwhelm, finally, superstition and belief. In our time, within 25 years, this thing that Tim Berners-Lee dreamt up over his Christmas holidays in CERN has utterly changed the world, the way it behaves, and the systems that govern it. First, it seized control of the economy, and when money meets technology multiplied by human greed, then the economy collapses and puts tens of millions of people out of work, out of their homes, out of their families, and provides for the collapse of all sorts of systems, including health systems. If the economy changes, the politics must change too, and maybe that's what we're witnessing right now. One hopes so. But we still don't have in place the global institutions that can manage any new compact. Much less are we cooperating. Rather, we've begun to face off in silence against each other. There is a codependence, but as you know from your own personal relationships, that's never healthy. There is a codependence, for example, between Australia and China. There clearly is a codependence between Europe and Russia. It disgusts me. It disgusts me that for fear of going cold next winter, instead of putting on an extra jumper or a coat, we kowtow to that brute in the Kremlin. It disgusts me. What those institutions will be, I don't know, but I've got a strange inkling that what this vile disease brought forth was a new and unique cooperation and combination of talents. I'm not trying to fit where my thoughts are going just to accommodate you people. I don't do accommodation very easily, I have to tell you. But 30 years ago, when my friends began to hurt, and we were scared, stiff, as I said yesterday, terrorized that that thing that makes us most human, sex, particularly through love, should be so debased by this vicious little thing that we didn't know what it was until Francoise and Luc came along. We lived in abject terror. Those of you my age will remember that. And then we thought, well, it only fits one part of the community. And the problem with that was that though no one will admit it, once that relief had hit home, underneath was the unspoken little worm of a thought that, well, faggots. What do you expect? And then it was discovered that we all could get it. And then we found out that the most vulnerable were, of course, the most vulnerable in society itself. And then we found out that the poorest of the poor, the weakest in terms of those less capable of speaking out or defending themselves, well, that's where it went mad. And we gather here today under the awful shadow of the loss of many Australians, but also great friends, heroes, co-workers. And I was reading this morning a great piece by the man I was speaking to yesterday, Waleed Ali, in one of your newspapers. And he talked about a sort of hierarchy of death, that quite rightly there was this immense grief an outpouring of sympathy and rage for those people who died in that murder up in the sky last week. And he said, it's odd because it's understandable, it's excellent, it's true, and it's right. But it is odd because every month on the roads in Australia, 29 people die. We don't feel the same. And he went on to try and work out why that should be. And of course, it's self-evident, I think, to be wrenched out of the sky on your way to your holidays, on your way to speak to a conference that offers nothing but good, nothing but hope, nothing but optimism. To be so innocent and so murdered is a grave shock to the human psyche, whereas the casualties on the road is, they're probably pissed or not looking or talking on their phone or somebody else was to blame. It's somehow comprehensible. But still underneath, we're saying awful for the family, but. Now, I am dismayed that as we tumble or stumble or lurch into the inevitability of the 21st century, which will someday soon arrive, that you people have such difficulty after such a great scientific global health success that you still beg for cash. Here you are, one of the great human stories of our time. That and the vanquishing of poverty, and the two are completely related. Nowhere, not even on Australian television, in those 2 hours of horror this morning, were you. Nowhere were the people in whose name you worked. Nowhere. Yet throughout Eastern Europe, with its brutish nonsense, the figures escalate. Africa, of course, as ever, unmentioned, but that is where the vast bulk of the victims of AIDS, TB, and malaria reside. And we don't really hear that much about TB and malaria because we don't get it. So, boring. But we will get it. Malarial mosquitoes have been found due to climate change now up around mid-Italy. TB is breaking out in Britain due to badgers infecting cattle. It's a huge problem across Eastern Europe again in particular, but we don't hear about it. When we do hear about AIDS, it's tired. And I can't do what you guys do. Of course, I'm in admiration for the genius behind the science. Of course, I'm in admiration for the selflessness of the doctors and nurses, for the will of the activists. But what people like Gates and Clinton and Bono, and though I'm not in that stellar league, myself do, is we talk it. And our difficulty is finding the language that revivifies, makes live again the nightmare of this thing and the great human success of what has been achieved so far, to put together something like the Global Fund or Gavi or any of these institutions to deal with humans. All of us, whoever. See, that strikes me as being the beginning of an understanding of a potentially different century. And the fact that only 30 years since I sat terrified with a dying friend in New York, you've nearly nailed it. On this last mile, on this final hurdle, we cannot allow indifference, incapable governance to stop the final victory which is coming. I'm not sure why you're going to South Africa. I know the South African representative is here. It has been almost criminal in its denial of its own people's illness. It has been almost criminal in its lack of responsibility of dealing with it. I've raised this with that government, with their presidents, on numerous occasions. It's changing. About time. It's been long enough. South Africa gave $1.5 million to the Global Fund last year. How changing is that? Disgrace. $1.5 million from a budget of 376 billion GDP. Disgraceful. This should be pointed out because that's what I have to do. Sometimes I have to use inflammatory language. Sometimes I read today in the paper that my talk yesterday was littered with profanities. Fuck them. For the gentlemen in the press and the ladies, I would like to inform you that there is nothing more profane than the disease with which this conference is trying to deal with. So you'll go to South Africa, and along with Nigeria and Uganda, where this beast, Yeats's beast, slouching towards its own Bethlehem, is riding high. And underneath it all, just like the different communities I saw in the village, is this underlying thing about, well, junkies, what do you expect? Gays, hookers, well, dude. That's the language people speak. That's the way they talk. That's the way this has to be addressed. And underlying all of that, Africans. We don't see them. We don't hear them. But hey, you know, what can you do? Africa, mess. Underlying all of this, there is a terrible darkness. And you represent the light. And we must call out that prejudice. And it will not be done using the rights-based language that you're using at the moment. It will not be done. And I'll explain what I mean by that, because this is where you have got monstrous problems. I've got a small one. How do I talk and make people see we're nearly there? It's not going to affect you probably, but that's not the point. This great global effort, we're nearly there. But when people talk in this sort of ragbag of lifestyle choices and a personal assumption of rights, it doesn't work. It doesn't work. What do you mean, what am I talking about? I'm talking about the fact that what we assume in this part of the world to be universal concerns often turn out to to be just parochial laws. That's what I mean. That what we say is necessarily right, others simply don't agree with. And to spite us, they put into law those things that they know we will find offensive, but are entirely endorsed by the local culture, which only goes to strengthen the despot's hand. Uganda, Nigeria, Russia. I love when you shout at me. I love when you disagree with me. It's just what I'm thinking, dude. And if I start talking about rights and those sort of things, bang, out they go. They're gone. With rights come responsibilities and obligations. If you bring up these things, you'll be 3 hours debating it. What needs to be told is how awful this thing still is, what it does to entire countries, never mind individuals or communities, how the net sucking out of the world economic good is distorted by this singular disease, which we are almost nearly there in defeating. Let's not get distracted by diversionary language. Let's call it as it is. And that's the point of these conferences, to speak the truth unto each other, to gather together, because everyone is out there doing their own thing singularly. And by coming together here, yes, there's the networking, yes, there's the common understanding, yes, there's the self-congratulations, justifiably. And leaving here, though, too, with a great sense of triumph, commitment and vindication, but knowing full well, though you're on the last gasp, that the science proceeds apace. Through Francois still committing her life to this and all the others, while you will never give up. The language is tired. The story doesn't have to be reinvented, just the language. Identifying the red ribbon. We got pink ribbons, we got yellow ribbons, we got this ribbon, we got that. What are you wearing today? See, I'm just telling you what my problem is. The scientists can do their thing. The field workers do theirs, the doctors, the nurses, the activists. But trying to say what this great victory will be when it comes. And meanwhile, you fight for that last scrap of cash. China, $5 million. GDP, 8.9 trillion. Dude, if you want to be the global player, we're not very concerned about the Spratly Islands. Leave them alone. We're concerned about you paying your way with responsibility into the global community. There's a cost for power. See, I'm free to beat up Abbott and Gillard and Bishop. It's easy. And it's right and it's fair, and they can come back at me and call me the most appallingly haired pop singer in all history or something. Russia, 2 trillion, 100 million bucks. The disease is rampant through failing health systems, through incapable governance, through indifferent leadership. And the way around it is to put in place discriminatory laws that pleases the church, which the politicians need on side, and pleases the population because it somehow makes them feel better. Saudi Arabia. Don't tell me there's no AIDS there, please. Saudi Arabia, 20 million. GDP, I think I've got it right, 700 billion. The rest of the world must face its responsibilities. The Germans, 800 million. The British, 760. The glorious and generous Americans as ever, footing the bill. The rest of the world must come to the party. They are not immune. I don't know how to get to the Chinese. They don't give a crap about us. Somehow, they must be made to pony up. This is right. This is just. You have nothing to say to us if you don't take on your global responsibility as the coming economy and one of the great superpowers. So we're nearly there. Tennyson said, "Come, friends, 'tis not too late to make the world anew." It's never too late to reinvent language, the story, the reality. The reality is too many put upon people, put upon because the way they choose to live, put upon because of their sexuality, put upon because of their job, put upon because of their poverty. Just because you're poor, you die. I refuse that. I'll be in South Africa a couple of times before the end of the year. We'll argue there. I'll make my points. In 2 years' time, you'll have come further along the line. In 2 years' time, there'll be more science. In 2 years' time, we'll be getting there. The 2 choke points, funding, distribution, we'll be getting there. I'll do my thing. I'll make a racket. I'll help you as much as I can. But what you take from this conference must be a renewed commitment. That's all. There's that great couplet from the genius German poet Goethe. You probably know it. Whatever you can do, or dream you can, begin it. Boldness has genius, power, and magic in it. Good luck.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Professor Olive Shazana, co-chair of the AIDS 2016 conference to take place in Durban, South Africa in July 2016.
I am honored to be here today. Sir Bob, unfortunately, he left, but it's a hard act to follow. And I'm going to do my best. It's been a great pleasure to be in Melbourne this week, and my warmest thanks go to Francois, Sharon, and the International AIDS Society for being such gracious hosts this past week. My sincere congratulations to you for pulling off a remarkable conference that really did set a high bar for our event in Durban in terms of science and the prioritization of a focus on key affected populations. So, we return to Durban, a decade and a half since our beloved Nelson Mandela addressed the International AIDS Conference in the same city. And he changed forever the HIV/AIDS response in Africa. For any of you who were there, I do believe that you will never forget the words that he said. But how far have we really come? What have we learned? And what do we expect in Durban 2016? As a starting point, please allow me to share with you the good news. It's true to say that the extraordinary shift in the global response to the HIV/AIDS epidemic in sub-Saharan Africa over the past 15 years have been one of humanity's shining achievements in recent times. The enormity of the scale of the implementation of treatment, care, and prevention on the ground across the continent has undoubtedly been a global health milestone, on a par with the vaccination campaign of years gone by. The rollout of antiretroviral therapy, surely one of the greatest scientific developments in recent memories, has saved an estimated 9 million life years in sub-Saharan Africa. Some 56% of eligible people on the continent were receiving ART in 2011. That is higher than the global average of 54%. And yes, still nowhere near where we want it to be. But if we recall what pending disaster we were facing at the beginning of the 2000s, one simply has to acknowledge that the transformation of the epidemic and indeed the health infrastructure and system in so many countries resembles a revolution of sorts. Botswana, Namibia, Rwanda, Swaziland, and Zambia have all achieved universal access to ART. This is truly remarkable. We know that ART has driven down both infections, in terms of new infections, as well as AIDS-related deaths, and it has done so dramatically. New HIV infections have declined by 25% in the decade to 2011. And between 2005 and 2011, AIDS mortality declined by 32%, a trend that finally began in the mid-2000s, in large part due to the availability of antiretroviral therapy. The number of African women receiving nevirapine for preventing mother-to-child transmission has dramatically increased, and in some countries like South Africa and Botswana, is nudging almost 100% coverage. Childhood infections across the continent are falling, with a 24% decline between 2009 and 2011 alone. But what remains to be done? Or, as some might say, the bad news. We are, and make no mistake, we are at a critical juncture in the sub-Saharan HIV/AIDS epidemic. It is clear that there remain substantial barriers to ending the epidemic, and it is in everyone's interest that they be addressed in the conversations presently taking place around the post-2015 development agenda. In a nutshell, sub-Saharan Africa, despite all the impressive gains that I've just listed, still shoulders a vastly disproportionate burden of the epidemic with high prevalence and mortality. And of course, one needs to be mindful when generalizing on statistics. The good news of decreases in new infections and AIDS deaths are not shared evenly across regions or countries. Incidence is still on the rise, for instance, in Guinea-Bissau, and only stable in countries like Tanzania, Uganda, and Nigeria, Gambia, Lesotho, Congo, Benin, and Angola. Art coverage tells a similarly uneven pattern. Universal coverage of treatment in Botswana, Namibia, Rwanda, Swaziland, and Zambia is an extraordinary step forward to eliminating AIDS in those countries. That's some 12 million people on the continent, that is a third of the global number of people that are living with HIV/AIDS, are still unable to access art, is at the same time an extraordinary impediment to ending AIDS across the continent. Even in situations where people have been accessing treatment, retention rates in some areas have become barriers themselves. Nearly half of all the people in Malawi and nearly 40% in Kenya who initiated art in the mid-2000s were no longer in care 5 years later. There's an urgent need for a discussion among those of us academics, health professionals, activists, and bureaucrats around the post-2015 scenarios if the epidemic is to continue changing in the right gears. While so much has changed, too much, unfortunately, has stayed the same. Gender inequality continues to see women share the burden of the epidemic, with 58% of the people living with HIV in sub-Saharan Africa being females. The risk factors for females, which are physiological vulnerability, social and economic inequalities, unequal access to education and employment, gender violence, difficulty negotiating sex, and condom use, all of this continue to fuel the epidemic. Stigma and discrimination, as they do in many countries dealing with HIV and AIDS epidemic, continue to hinder the implementation of science on the ground. In recent years, much has been made of the punitive anti-homosexuality laws that exist in some 35 African countries, and the more recent severe amendments made to them in a number of countries such as Uganda and Nigeria. Most prominent epidemiologists are telling us that we have many men who have sex with men and transgendered epidemics in numerous sub-Saharan African countries. Yet in many instances, we are powerless to intervene on the ground in any meaningful way because of fear of reprisals. We must have the courage of our conviction to question these acts that violate the rights to choose sexual orientation. The same could be said to apply to the drug user community. We know that the science is telling us that we have some alarming sub-epidemics amongst people who inject drugs, and it is telling us that even in some international forums, the issue of drug use and HIV is nowhere prominent on agenda as it ought to be. We must have the courage to place it on the agenda, particularly at these forums. And in Durban, I can assure you we'll put it on the agenda. The past 3 decades of HIV and AIDS has taught us that the disease doesn't discriminate, but that people and governments do. A renewed engagement with decision makers across the continent on the issue of human rights will be unavoidable if we are to move forward towards ending AIDS in sub-Saharan Africa and build huge gains that we've made over the past 15 years. We must also make sure that children and adolescents are not left behind if our future is to be secured. We must demand testing and treatment for all the children who are affected. We must make sure programs are implemented. It is my hope that the Durban 2016 International AIDS Conference will drive momentum towards reinvigoration of the HIV/AIDS response in Africa. It is my hope that we should share with you some of the great scientific work that is being done on HIV in the African soil. It is my hope that we should be sharing with you progress that Africa will be making in reducing new infections and mortality. It is my hope that when we meet in Durban in 2016, we'll come away with a practical roadmap on how to end all AIDS deaths on the continent and have all those in need on treatment receiving it. It is my hope that post-Durban, that we can meaningfully see in the very near future the end of AIDS in Africa. I hope to see you there, and thank you very much.
Greetings to all of you, delegates to the 2014 International AIDS Conference. I hope you enjoy the following video montage, which will show you what South Africa and Durban has to offer, and that you will all, and many more people, join us in 2 years' time, not only for the conference, but also to come and enjoy South Africa, our country. When the International AIDS Conference was held in Durban, South Africa in 2000, the global HIV community put the spotlight on Africa, the epicenter of the epidemic. At that time, we collectively faced what has been termed as one of the biggest challenges to humankind, the HIV epidemic. We did not imagine that 15 years later, we could comfortably claim that we have made huge progress globally and in Africa in particular in responding to the challenge of HIV. It is our hope that maybe in 2 years' time, the promising research on finding a cure and a vaccine would have advanced so far that AIDS 2016 would be another historic International AIDS Conference where significant scientific advances will be presented. As South Africa, we will continue to improve on our HIV and AIDS response in the coming years and will even have more to report on at the AIDS 2016 conference in Durban. The massive rollout of our treatment program will continue, as will the goal to be self-financed. When we meet many of you in 2 years, we will also be back on track with our prevention programs. It is certainly a crucial time in the fight against HIV and AIDS, and I'm certain that AIDS 2016, like AIDS 2000, will be an important milestone in that fight. South Africa, on behalf of the African continent, is very much looking forward to welcoming you all to 2016 International AIDS Conference. I thank you.
To rise above our differences and combine our efforts to save our people. History will judge us harshly if we fail to do so now and right now.
stop until everyone in Africa, everyone in Asia, everyone